It becomes really like a repertory company, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
With an ensemble cast. Do you find that readers, do you hear from them, do they get attached to particular characters?
Oh yes, certain characters, they love them or they hate them. You know, letters will say, send so-and-so away, or don't you dare have her break up with Hyber Pinsky, or, you know, fire that character and hire a new one.
I remember, you might even remember too, when she had a romance, I think it was before High, but it might have been 2 before High. And I thought it was all going to work out, and then you split them up, and I wrote you a really irate letter.
I think that was Don, the disc jockey.
I don't remember. No, I think he was the older man.
Maybe that was George.
Yes.
George wanted to have a child.
That was George.
And she couldn't figure out how she'd manage it on stakeouts.
And a good point, yes. Like child care or same thing. But I remember, I thought it was interesting that I was so irritated with you that I actually wrote a really crabby letter and said, Marcia, what are you doing with George?
It's on file.
I know, once past sins probably never escape us. But I thought that was, you know, that was my reaction, and I'm sure that lots of readers get so caught up in this fictional world.
They get caught up in it to the extent that sometimes the people are more real to them, the characters, than the author. I had someone last night call me Sharon, which I took as very flattering because it means I've created somebody that they feel is a real individual.
Do you think that readers often believe the sleuth or the characters you're writing about to be at least semi-autobiographical?
I think most readers would. As people who aren't writers, you know, aren't aware of the synthesis that goes on in the process of creating someone. Sharon was very unlike me when the series began, and I set her up to be that way because I didn't want to do a lot of autobiographical sloppy writing. But as we've progressed over the years, being best friends and alter egos, we've become more and more alike.
That's fascinating. Do you talk to her?
Not in public.
At least in your head.
Oh, yes.
And does she tell you by now? I would imagine that she kind of tells you where you're going wrong if you're getting her to do something she doesn't want.
Yeah, if there's a false note, it becomes obvious very quickly. And very often, I'll be in the process of writing and I'll discover something about her that I previously didn't know. For instance, in last year's book, which has just been reissued in paperback, her father dies. And the book initially was supposed to be about how his death sent her on a search for her 1/8 Indian roots. Well, it turned out when I hit about page 20, I realized that she was really searching for 100% roots because she had been adopted and would find this out.
That was such a surprise. I mean, we had been with Sharon for, well, what, 20 books?
Yeah.
And suddenly to discover that this whole family that we knew and we had lived through her parents' divorce, we had lived through how their lives had changed, the impact on her family, Sharon's sister, who I thought you were going to keep happily married to the original guy until the end, but you tricked me there. And then all of a sudden, we discover in this book that Sharon is not, in fact, a blood relationship of any of these people.
I was
surprised.
You know, I looked back when the idea first came into my head, and I looked back at all the references to that family, and there was always the idea that she was different. You know, the white sheep in a family of black sheep. She looked different. She was motivated where some of them were less than competent. And it was all built into the series without me knowing it.
That really is interesting. The one thing that I did have to wonder, and I can see how it would go, was the fact that they had been through so much trauma, her parents and Sharon, and yet somehow that was the one thing they had never told her. I mean, their lives had really been stripped awfully raw and reassembled.
Yeah, so this is a very dysfunctional family.
That's
and
true.
I think the motivation behind that, the mother was afraid of losing her if she found out because they concealed it so long. The father wanted her to know, which was why he asked that she go through his papers when he died.
So he didn't, he
And he
had a
left.
pact with his wife not to tell her.
Well, they had a pact, but it had really ruined their lives because of the disagreement on it and ruined the marriage.
Aha, which is a truth that, in fact, goes back then and illuminates the earlier books when
Yes.
that marriage disintegrated, doesn't it?
Yes, strange how we can rewrite the past.
Isn't that intriguing? I wonder if that was your writer's subconscious all along, or just happy coincidence? It's hard to
Well,
say.
it could be. I'm a big believer in the subconscious. It's where most of my work comes from. The solutions to the crimes, all of it.
There's also, I've heard writers speak about the idea that stories write themselves, or that, who was it once that said, you know, that what they're really doing, what she, I think it was a she, but it might have been a he, was really kind of just taking dictation from stories that already existed. And this is kind of suggestive in a way that maybe
Yes.
that's not as absurd or off the wall an idea as one might think.
No, I think that there's a great deal about the subconscious coming into play. And you know, I had always intended to do something with her roots, but not gotten to it until my editor said to me, you know, you should do more with this history. It's really, then you get the thoughts flowing.
It's intriguing because when it comes up earlier, I mean, lots of authors seem to be driven to it along about book 4 or book 5. I was thinking about Michael Connelly wrote 3 Harry Bosch books, and then in the 4th one, which in many ways is my favorite, and I'm going blank, it's the one with the coyote in the title.
Coyote Waits.
The yeah, it is the
Yeah.
Coyote Waits.
Yeah.
Thank you, because Coyote Revenge was Fred Harris. Titles tend to run together. That's when he sent Harry on a search, in fact, for the truth of his own mother's murder, which is a little bit like James Ellroy's
it
real
is.
life experience. But anyway, that was the book where we got to know Harry in terms of his past. And then I remember Michael saying to me that book 5, which was Angel in Darkness? Angel's Flight?
Angel's Flight? No, I'm not sure.
Well, the Angel
Angels.
book, no, it wasn't actually. It was the book before then. Gosh, I'm embarrassing myself here because I can't remember the name. But anyway, whatever it was, book 5, Michael said that Harry had done basically 4 personal cases that had all been about chasing down, you know, one serial killer. One of them appeared in more than one book, and then his mother. And that if he was going to be a cop and he was going to write a credible series about a cop, he needed to give Harry a case that arose from his professional life and had no personal connection. It was just a case he was working because he caught, you know, he caught the call on the night of the murder and so forth. And I thought that was such a good point. And then Bob Crayas came here to sign Voodoo River, in which Elvis Cole, who'd always been in Los Angeles, he and Joe and whatever, suddenly they're in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And the character is looking, the client is looking for her birth parents. And what a surprise it was when Bob came to do the signing, and he revealed that, in fact, bursting into tears, which surprised him probably even more than me and everybody else, that he was adopted. And that he had gone on this quest to write Voodoo River, whatever it is, because he'd had a medical problem. And while he loved his adopted parents and didn't actually want to know his birth parents, that wasn't his imperative, he had to find some medical information. And Baton Rouge is, in fact, where all this happened to him.
It's interesting.
Isn't it?
Well, you know, my husband always says it's all grist for the mill. Everything that happens to us goes, I always have to tell people to be careful what they say to me if they don't want to see it somewhere in print.
Well, you know, if in fact all of this is subconscious process, I suppose that anything goes in, gets
Whatever
worked
goes
around,
in.
it comes out somewhere or other. An interesting idea. Well, it seems to be over the years you've been pretty hard on Sharon. I mean, you've trashed her whole life. And
Oh, yeah. You know, I get bored very easily. And once she gets too comfortable, I like to do things to shake it up a little bit. I've always had a fear of the doorbell ringing and this woman who looks very familiar standing there saying, okay, now you're going to answer for what you've done.
well, when we started out with Edmund, take us back, if you will, and then we're going to move on to your new book, but I think that so many readers are going to be familiar with Sharon, we ought to talk about her. What was her role in Edwin? It was a book that took place in an antique store, wasn't it?
Yes, she was at that time a chief investigator, the only investigator for a law cooperative in San Francisco. And a client was murdered, and they used the excuse of her inventorying the contents of the antique shop in order for her to investigate the murder.